right, I'd like to invite Deanna Chorney again from the City of Toronto, where she's the project manager in charge of consultations and setting recommendations for inclusionary zoning.
And does this mic work as well?
Maybe. Do you like that one?
Oh, that one's gonna. Just want to check if this one's on. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, great. So I thought I had a little bit more time, so I'm going to try and run through my slides quite quickly. But as Martine mentioned, we have been working on developing our policy approach and starting consultations on inclusionary zoning. I wasn't able to be here this morning, so I'm going to run through a little bit of information just in terms of what we see as some of the big trends related to housing affordability in the city. I'm sure for many of you this will be no surprise, and maybe you've already talked about it this morning, but wanted to flag a few things. So the first piece, certainly, that is no surprise to many of you, is that housing affordability has become a bigger and bigger issue in terms of conversations in our public realm. We saw in the most recent municipal election, affordability was the top issue for many people, and in fact surpassed transit in many different polls. And certainly in my time at working in the city, that has been a shift in terms of we're seeing not only some of the folks who are most in need of housing really impacted by our housing market, but also sort of our middle income households as well. So this is a snapshot of what we call our development pipeline. So this looks at all the different applications that have been submitted, built, and under review in the city. And what we know is we have seen a huge amount of development over the past 5 years. And our market has been quite strong. We have almost 300,000 residential units that are currently with development approvals or are under review in the city. So just to give you a snapshot, if all of those units were approved and built, it would be equivalent to increasing our total housing stock by nearly a quarter. So that's all good news in terms of increasing supply. However, and one of the more startling statistics, if you look at in the past 5 years how many of those units have been quote unquote affordable, only 2% have actually achieved kind of affordable prices, and that has been strictly the result of programs and funding. The other indicators around affordable housing and affordability are no better. We know that particularly in 2017, we saw a number of records related to affordability and not good ones. We saw the biggest year-over-year increase to average market rents in 2017 over the last 15 years. We also saw the lowest vacancy rate in the past 16 years. And 2018 has shown kind of some of those same trends. And in addition to that, we're kind of staying consistent in terms of about 47% of the city's renters pay more than 30% of their income towards housing costs. And for more and more people, the gap between when they're looking for accommodation today, they're looking to pay a lot more than our average market rents. So this is just a bit of a snapshot to give you an idea in terms of where we've seen, on a spatial lens, where we've seen some of the bigger impacts on affordability. So this is looking at where households are paying actually more than 50% of their income on housing, renter households. And you can see that it's certainly not the same level throughout the city. And in fact, some of our areas where we've seen the most growth, so in our downtown along that young corridor, have some of the highest numbers of households who are paying more than 50% of their income towards housing. This is another snapshot relating to kind of these housing indicators, and this is looking at suitable housing. So suitable housing basically means, do you have enough bedrooms for the people in your household? And here you can see the dark red or dark pink pictures, or dark pink colors show where there's a higher number of households who are in suitable housing. And really what the data for me, the takeaway here is that for many people, it's kind of a choice between affordability and suitability. And so in order to be able to afford their housing, they're living in more unsuitable conditions. So not having a big enough space for your family of three kids or what have you. So our current affordable definition at the city that the city uses in our official plan and in a lot of our housing programs is related to market rents. So our affordable rents are considered average market rents for the city as a whole by unit type, so by number of bedrooms. So for instance, the city defines an affordable one bedroom as $1,270 or below, inclusive of utilities. And our affordable ownership definition is tied to those average market rents. So for instance, affordable ownership, our definition currently is about $214,000. So what this means in terms of when we look at the percentiles of income, and this is from the most recent census data, what this means is that in general, our average market rents are hitting about the 45th to 65th percentile of renter households. So that's sort of in the middle range of that 30th to 60th, but certainly for some that's going beyond the 60th percentile, which is widely thought of as sort of that moderate middle income. And that varies by, if we look at a bachelor, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, and so on. So to break that down, what does that mean in terms of actually when people are looking for housing? So if you're looking for a bachelor or 1 bedroom unit, as I mentioned, 1 bedroom average market rents are $1,270, and for a bachelor, they're $1,089. Here, we're showing that the folks who would be able to afford those units would range from administrative assistants, garbage truck drivers, carpenters, and so on. Those are single-person households. Certainly, if you had dependents, you would be stretched in terms of affordability. You wouldn't be able to achieve or afford those average market rents. And then we've also identified if you maybe had a dry cleaner, an early childhood educator, you could potentially afford the average market rent for a 2-bedroom. But the bad news story is that average market rents really aren't reflective of asking rents for someone who's going out into the market today. So if you no longer, your family has grown, you no longer are gonna be able to stay in your 1-bedroom unit, or you've recently moved to the city, you're looking to pay about 40% more than average market rent. So you can see here that we're showing the average market rent for a 1-bedroom at $1,270, but the asking rent is actually close above $1,700. So what that means in terms of these occupations is a dental assistant, for instance, would only be able to afford a bachelor apartment in terms of average market rents, but is priced out for a bachelor apartment in terms of asking rents. So we know that there's a bigger and bigger shift in terms of both for incoming households in the city, as well as people who are looking for their first home and apartment to rent. So I'll touch on a little bit of what Richard spoke about in terms of our approach for inclusionary zoning for Toronto. And as I mentioned, I will try and run through these fairly quickly. The first big piece is that, as Richard, I think, alluded to, inclusionary zoning is just one policy tool that has a potential to positively impact housing affordability. It's not the only tool. It's not a panacea in terms of addressing all of these different issues. And certainly the city, as part of our housing plan, is looking at a whole host of different initiatives and actions that hopefully will have a positive impact in terms of making our city more affordable. So there's current programs such as Housing Now and Open Door that are really intended to focus on a deeper level of affordability, as well as programs like supportive housing and shelters and so on. Inclusionary zoning is truly a policy tool and is intended in terms of our housing ecosystem to address more of that moderate income housing stock and households, and would need a lot more financial assistance to be able to address that deeper need. We have been working along on developing our policy approach since the provincial regulation was enacted last April. And in fact, we've been working before that as well. Certainly Bill 108, which I'll speak to at the end, has thrown a little bit of a curveball in terms of our timelines and what we're anticipating. But our hope at this point is that we will be able to, commence consultation towards the end of June. So we're going to what's called our Planning and Housing Committee on May 28th with a report on our proposed policy directions. And from that, we'll be starting a wide campaign to really get public and stakeholder input in terms of what is the right inclusionary zoning policy and approach for the City of Toronto. This will be happening in coordination with our housing plan. So I think maybe some of you may have gone to consultations on our 10-year housing plan that were held last month. And so we'll be making sure that this tool is aligned with that work. We had identified that, hopefully by the end of this year, we would be bringing forward final policies. We're still reviewing that timeline as part of Bill 108. So the big two pieces for the city, in addition to just making sure that new developments are inclusive and truly provide for mixed income housing, is balancing these two different competing pieces. One is increasing the supply of affordable housing, but the second is ensuring that we're continuing to encourage the supply of market housing, right? So an inclusionary zoning tool that is too strong in terms of having requirements that maybe the market can't bear could have the impact of diminishing the supply of market housing, which then effectively diminishes the amount of affordable you're going to achieve. So here, this is just a little piece. The provincial regulation that the province enacted last April had a number of different pieces that requires municipalities to do. And this work is what we've been working on for the past year and a bit. And the first piece is this municipal assessment report, which I'll speak briefly about, but it essentially has basically a housing need and demand analysis, as well as a financial impact analysis that's required. And those pieces need to be considered as part of your official plan policies and consulted on as part of your policy framework. After that, the policies need to be approved by the Minister of Municipal Affairs, and they get basically a 10-month timeline before they have to make a decision. Once the minister has made a decision, the city would be able to implement and require affordable housing in new developments. So as part of our housing need and demand and our financial analysis, we're really looking at all different pieces from demographics, from current housing supply that's planned, as well as all the financial impacts related to inclusionary zoning. And for that work, we've retained a consultant who is doing what's called a residual land value analysis, which is quite common in a number of other jurisdictions as well, and looking at what the impact it would be on the market. So to kind of further Richard's point in terms of, well, where is that impact? There is an understanding that the impact will come off of the land, and the analysis that the city is doing is trying to figure out, so what areas the city is the market strong enough that the land can absorb that additional affordable housing requirement without making property owners say, I'm not going to sell because it's just not worth it to me. My land today is worth a lot more. And so that's figuring out, does that work in all areas of the city? Are there specific markets that are more able to absorb that than others? So as part of our policy considerations, we're looking at all that housing need and demand and the financial analysis, and we're looking at a whole host of different pieces. Part of that is understanding how other jurisdictions have used it, inclusionary zoning, which generally we've seen about 10 to 25% requirements in terms of that new developments would need to provide that level of affordable housing. That's typically a middle income, as I mentioned, policy tool, so focusing on that 1/3 of income, and affordability periods ranging from 40 years to permanent, and so on. So we're digesting all of those pieces, and certainly in the context of Bill 108, how to apply inclusionary zoning. And the big pieces for us are, so at what scale development should this apply? Should this apply to just, a small mid-rise development? Certainly the city wants to be encouraging a nice supply of missing middle types of housing. We're just looking at how to balance some of that deeper levels of affordability and longer levels of affordability. We know we can't achieve everything in one policy tool. And looking at a whole host of other pieces in terms of how to ensure this is a sustainable policy tool for the city. We've heard a lot through our stakeholder conversations already, and I expect we'll hear a lot more, that certainly there's a consensus. Housing affordability is an issue. I think it's an issue across for the development industry as well as for the public and stakeholders. But there is a concern, is this the right tool? Will it help those who most need affordable housing? And I think making sure that we understand is only one tool as part of our whole housing ecosystem is really important. We've heard concern that our definition of affordable housing really doesn't affect people who need housing most and doesn't address certain current incomes and so on. We've also heard, particularly from the development industry, that without financial incentives, there'll be a negative impact to housing supply. and that we should be providing for options for both affordable rental and affordable ownership housing. There's also been continued discussion about that the affordability should be provided long-term, and that any policy needs to provide certainty for developers. So just finally, in terms of how we understand what Bill 108 is now suggesting in terms of a change of course, the province has proposed that inclusionary zoning could now only apply in protected major transit station areas. So those are areas, but basically 500 to 800 meters from higher order transit, so from a GO station or a subway stop or so on, or a community planning permit system. And that would have to come through a provincial regulation where they would identify what community planning permit systems would apply to the city. So it's a bit of an unknown for us. We're still digesting what all that could mean, but certainly there may be a delay in terms of implementation on inclusionary zoning. However, as part of the provincial growth plan, we know we need to be basically bringing forward our protected major transit station areas and approaches for that by 2022. We could be bringing forward policies on protected major transit station areas at any time. So it still means a delay, but hopefully that's, there's enough strong support for this policy tool that will continue to advance as quickly as possible. Thank you.